Welcome back to the Free Spirits Podcast, where we dive into the functional and THC beverage industries. We explore the brand stories and the operations that redefine how we relax, connect, and socialize. I'm your host, Lars Miller, with my co-host, David Gonzalez. Before we jump in, quick reminder to check out our YouTube channel, subscribe, and follow us on whatever podcast platform you use, and you can find us on all of them, and your ratings and reviews really help us grow. As a personal note here, before we welcome our guest today, my very first THC drink ever was Cann. I was hanging out with some of my friends up in Chicago, went to Dispensary, got a couple cases, and when I cracked them open, my first initial feeling was, this is the future of social drinking. Now, I was completely wrong on the timeline and how quickly that was going to come to take over, but I am confident that that's still going to happen. And joining us today is the founder of Cann, Jake Bullock, and they are the leading microdose cannabis beverage brand. Welcome, Jake.
Yeah, doing all right. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you've had quite the journey in your career, and we'll get into all the specifics of your different career paths. But let's begin with what sparked the initial idea for Cann.
It's a good question. So the story kind of goes, I've grown up in Colorado, so I sort of observed the new dispensary adult use ecosystem that was emerging there, albeit from afar because I had left the state. So I was sort of like, more sort of emotionally connected to it than physically. But when I would go home and visit family and things like that, I was always under pressure from friends to smuggle back, some various dispensary products, which if you remember back to then, they were, like these Sour Patch Kid gummies that were, sprayed with THC oil, and the ends would get double dosed and the middle would be underdosed. And it was sort of a little bit of Russian roulette. It's always struck me that those products weren't going to be for me, the type of consumer I was, which was more or less, my share of intoxicants skewed pretty heavily alcohol. And it didn't really seem that this new wave of adult products that were going to kind of sweep the nation would be gummy candies. I just had a sense that it probably wouldn't be, right? And this sort of brought me to a period of time in my own life where alcohol started being more of an issue. Like I could not drink alcohol in my 30s the way I could in my 20s. Maybe that's because I was drinking too much alcohol in my 20s. We could debate that, but it wasn't working. And so what I wondered was, well, how do I, continue to be the social person that I want to be, right? I wasn't really, option was not sort of like, okay, great. This is your body telling you to slow down and, move to the country and have like a pastoral life. Like I still was planning on being social, but how do I do that without drinking as much? And this was really when I sort of connected the two dots, which was, well, we have this new intoxicant. It is migrating into the mainstream from this bizarre illicit past. And it's probably not going to be in a gummy candy or a piece of chocolate, where you like bite the corner off because too much, if you had any more, it would be too much. It's probably going to be a beverage because that's where, we consume mild intoxicants like caffeine and alcohol. And it's probably going to be in a microdose. And this was the sort of the big innovation that sort of struck me, which was, well, we actually drink alcohol in microdoses. That's like why you can have multiple beers or glasses of wine. I've had 3 cups of coffee today. Like I can only do that because my body is metabolizing the caffeine at a certain rate, right? Similar to how body metabolizes alcohol. So then the question became, well, what is the rate that the body metabolizes THC? Like, how do we think about that? And this is what brought us to the microdose end of the spectrum as we thought about what this product could potentially be. And what we found is if you took the dosing way down, it unlocked this amazing sort of social potential. It's very different than what historically folks consume cannabis. You light up a joint, you get high. It's pretty fast. It's pretty foolproof. It requires a lot of steps, but you can get it. You can learn those steps. This was something else. This was, how do we leverage the heuristics of drinking alcohol, which, millions and millions of people do in America every day, and try to capture that feeling that's way before getting too high. That's way before getting too drunk, right? That mild, sort of light, gentle, it's like a wave, it builds over time. How do we capture that? And can we do that with THC? And we found that you could. And so that was really the idea, and then how it came into this potential microdose beverage, rivaling alcohol in our social life.
So did you have any experience with cannabis beverages prior to inventing Cann?
Not direct experience, right? I had observed the ones that were on the shelf. When we started Cann, the most common product you would find would be 100 milligram, like it could be a lemonade or something like that. And it was often a lemonade because you needed the sugar, high acid to block the grassy chlorophyllic taste. And often it was coming out of solution and like oily slicks on the top. These things were pretty gnarly and also impossible to drink for somebody like me, right? Like, people say, just titrate it out into club soda. It's like, no, that's not going to work either. Like I couldn't even drink a cap full of it. So that was a problem. There were some that were kind of pushing down, like low dose was really 10 milligrams at the time, which is so crazy to think now where, we launched a product which was 2 milligrams, right? We're basically, we'll see your low dose and we will raise you a fifth of that. It didn't really spark the sort of energy behind budtenders and dispensary owners, as you can probably imagine, because they looked at 2 milligrams and said, okay, what am I meant to do with this? I would need to drink 20 of them to even feel anything. But what it did do is it caught that like 10% of folks that walk in a dispensary. Maybe they were grabbing like a CBD topical or they were consuming a gummy. They were biting the heads off them because they couldn't take this whole thing, right? That person, it piqued their interest. And we actually pulled those people into the dispensary in the early days to really get them to know that these products existed. And that was how we had to build the business in the early days, because it just there was a very clear mismatch between, what the market wanted, what was available at the time, and what we were offering.
Jake, I'm happy you brought up that point. Obviously, your journey stems from going in from this recreational adult use market into this kind of newer hemp marketplace. I want to take a step back and talk about your background. And so one of the things that stood out for me when just looking through your LinkedIn, economics degree from Duke, MBA from Stanford, worked as an analyst associate at investment groups like Bain Capital. And so the question that comes to mind for me is, how did that background influence your decision to become a market maker and ultimately decide to take the risk of launching a brand new category? To me, if I'm sitting as an analyst and I'm looking at risky decisions, launching a new category in cannabis is as risky as it gets. So how did you have that eureka moment where you said, all right, I've quantified my risk. I understand this marketplace, I understand the existing marketplaces, and I think there's a path here to create a new marketplace. What was that thought process like for you when you decided to make this leap and ultimately launch a new category?
I like the question. I was thinking about this the other day in sort of similar terms, which is you don't see a lot of people which have backgrounds like mine start companies. And it's largely, I think, what you identify, right? Like people that are good at making investments and working in places like Bain Capital are pretty good at assessing risk. They're pretty good at bounding that risk, right? And making decisions around it. And if you look at sort of what we did, it seems preposterously risky. Like what possibly could you expect to get out of this decision that would be commensurate, with the risk that you're taking? And so, I think that's true. I think that the way in which those jobs prepared me to do this is a little bit different, right? And maybe an argument for why people coming from investing in consulting and finance might actually be better starting companies is we were really good at compartmentalizing, particularly our emotions, right? These are intense jobs. There are like fire drills all the time, which are not real, like no one's dying, right? But what's actually happening is like, there's some urgent thing that we have to go run down the answer to or figure out, or, there's a lot of work that goes into making a really big investment. And so having had that experience, one, you learn the sort of toolkit, right? The analytical stuff, which was brought to bear here, right? Like it was analogs and looking at other industries that helped me really understand why this was like a gap in the market, right? In drawing those parallels to caffeine and alcohol. But more importantly, I was able to manage really, really intense, stressful situations. That is basically what starting a company is. You're going to have this roller coaster ride and being able to shut it off. You can't really ever shut it off. It's always there, but being able to compartmentalize that and just free yourself for like an hour to think in a clear-headed way about a business problem or manage the emotions up and down of the regulatory in this industry, right? Which is just, it's been so wild. So I think in those ways, it really has prepared me and in sort of maybe not the most expected way, but has been helpful.
Sure. I think it helps you keep a level head when there is so much chaos when you're building something. And again, not just a brand, but an entire new marketplace and an entire new way of drinking. Has so many implications with the amount of stress that could cause. But if you have this ability to take a breath and logically look through a situation, then level heads prevail. I guess my follow-up question would be, how did the marketplace, again, you're making this kind of on the fly in 2018. How does that compare to today, where it is such a different, I don't want to call it more sophisticated, more evolved. It is to some extent, but it's a little bit more of a different marketplace now. So now when you're assessing the marketplace, your opportunities, assessing risk, like how has it evolved over 6 years and how has that impacted how you guys operate?
It's interesting because I think, we only really sort of know the moment that we're in at each of these steps along the way, right? And so looking back, you can provide a lot of clarity, being like, oh, wow, wasn't it? I mean, it was hard back in the dispensary. We didn't know at the time. I mean, it was hard, but we associated it with sort of like, building a business is hard. It's a new category. Like it didn't feel like there was no reference point, right, to compare how hard the dispensary world was. But now I'm looking back and I'm like, well, thank God I'm not talking every day about bud tender education. Like that was a nightmare. The fact that was actually what we had to do to grow our brand is baffling. Or like managing the inventory of our retail partners, the dispensary side, when it's like, they don't even care about beverage. It's like, they're not managing the inventory. We're having to do it for them. They're placing orders on, weeks, sales data where we were out of stock for half the week. Like, I mean, stuff that you're sort of pulling your hair out, right? Wow. So in some ways that's gone away, right? Like we are in a more sophisticated retail environment where like Total Wine is managing its inventory well. Like it knows what's selling and how well it's selling. And so that's great, right? In some ways, because that helped, we think, ultimately like accrues positively to us as we execute it, at the store level and in the field and marketing, all this good stuff. So in that way, I think it's exciting. But in other ways, it's really challenging, right? So in a world where we had to compete and establish our brand in a dispensary environment, vis-a-vis other dispensary products, now we are on a shelf that has some of the biggest global brands. They are some of the biggest spenders on marketing, right? On product, on packaging. So it's a different world that we're in. And so, with that increased sophistication and it provides opportunity, but it also provides, an entirely different challenge, right? Which is how do we now compete against some of these really, really strong brands that have been around for 100 years and everybody knows their household names, Bud Light, Modelo, like Athletic Brewing. The NA products are sort of often next to us on the shelf and do extremely well, right? People are drinking less beer. And so, how do we think about how we fit in on that shelf, which is very, very different than a dispensary refrigerator where we were like next to staff lunches, right? Or whatever.
Right.
So you've mentioned a few things here. The 10% of the population that was going in for CBD topical, getting those users into the dispensary channel and building your business that way. Kind of take us back to those early days. What was that first dispensary wholesale order like? How did you get them to take that leap with you in the microdose?
It's a funny story.
Product.
So we started the company in Venice Beach. My co-founder and I moved out there once we'd raised a little bit of money. I just graduated from business school, so I'd spent every dollar I had on that. And he had just left Bain & Company, and so we raised a little bit of money. We moved to LA, and we were like, okay, let's live in Venice Beach. There were a handful of marijuana companies based around us. Our first two retail partners were MedMen and Ease. And actually, I think MedMen was the first one to place an order for the product. And they did it for 4 stores. It was like the 2 Venice stores, 1 in West Hollywood, I think maybe 1 down in like San Diego. And we got that purchase order. We went into the office, which was in, I think like Culver City or something like that. And we just sat in the kitchen with someone on the MedMen team who'd invited us in. And we brought a couple of 6-packs. We set them on the table. And he's always just sort of brought in people like key decision makers, buyers, merchants, folks on the exec team to just try Cann. Look at this new product. And we really sold them on, this is the mainstream consumer we're going after, right? This is the person that is not going into MedMen. They're afraid of dispensaries. They don't want to buy flower. Last time they had a THC product, they got way too high, and we're going to bring them into your store, and we're going to do it with cute pink cans and 2 milligrams of THC. And people tried the product, and for us in the early days, drinking the product was the key, and it still is for consumers. I think the taste was surprisingly good. People expect these products to be gross, and when they're so amazingly good, they're looking at each other being like, wait, is this real? And that's how we got it. And I remember being live in the MedMen kitchen and having the buyer say, oh, I think we could probably do this in June. That means you'd have to have it in the store by the 15th of May. And we're looking at it like, could you maybe do it in July? Like July would actually be much better than June for us. She's like, no, I think June. And so then we ripped out of that meeting and we're like, heads down, had maybe 6 weeks to figure out how to make the first. And it was like 5,000 cans, right? Which looking back now, it's like so small. And make 5,000 cans. How are we going to do this? Manufacturing facility was like literally like a basement in San Diego. They were, filling vape carts. It was kind of crazy. Like, how do we figure out how to do this? We did. It was pretty amazing. And then, following the first couple of weeks of that product being on the market, they expanded to all 11 locations. They like more than doubled the order per store. And so we were like, okay, now we need actually a real beverage manufacturing line to pull this one off because the order size got so big. But those were like sort of those fun moments where it was just one way or another, we were going to figure it out. We're like calling the testing lab like every hour, being like, are the results back? Are the results back? It was pretty wild. But we figured out how to get the product, and it worked. And then pretty quickly after that, signed a distributor, had a manufacturing line up and running, and that we were off to the races.
Yeah, and you guys have had obviously a shift from just the dispensary channel regulatory states to now you're obviously in the hemp-derived marketplace as well. So what has been the biggest shift over the last 6-7 years in consumer acceptance of the microdose category?
It's what's so interesting to us is, in some ways what we did at Cann was a pivot, like a classic business pivot, right? You hear about in startups all the time, where we sort of took an asset that the company had and we redeployed it in a different market channel, different direction, right? What's strange about this pivot is that to the consumer, nothing changed, right? To be like a consumer CPG beverage product, and actually the product stays almost exactly the same, right? The difference being obviously the ingredient, the active ingredient that we extract from hemp instead of from marijuana. But what changes is the entire route to market, the distribution environment, the regulatory, the legal, like manufacturing, everything else that the consumer doesn't see changes, which is kind of wild, right? Because if you think about it, it usually works the other way around. There's some sort of like capability or technology or assets that you develop, outside of your end users' purview, and then you sort of redeploy that and create a different product. We kept the product the same, almost identical, with the exception of the change to the active ingredient source. And to the consumer, their experience is identical, right? And so it's this really amazing thing that happened. And the only reason we did it, or would have gone down this road, was Minnesota passed this funny law where they said, you can extract the THC and CBD from hemp. You can sell it in all the places where we sell alcohol in the state. And Minnesota has separate entrance alcohol sales. So that really meant that, like, they were saying, if you can make this from hemp, you can sell in anywhere the alcohol can be sold alongside alcohol. And this had been our dream from the beginning. We launched Cann with the vision that one day you have beer, wine, and Cann at all social occasions. Like, we're now able to sell alongside alcohol. And we knew this because we knew it from our dispensary ecosystem, where really we were sort of like the unfortunate stepchild in that world, that the consumer wanted this product, but the consumer wanted it where they buy alcohol. That's where the decision was happening. That's like our drinker. We're not like convincing people to stop smoking weed and drink it instead. We're convincing people to drink a little bit less booze. And so that has to happen where alcohol is sold. And we knew that if we could just get into those environments, we would see, pretty incredible sales. And that's really what has like catalyzed adoption. I think interestingly, it's coming full circle, right? Because we are meeting people for the first time on the shelf alongside athletic brewing, alongside, cocktail brands and alcohol brands. And those customers are saying, oh, I'm going to try Cann tonight. They get comfortable with THC in a way that is almost a dream scenario for the broader cannabis industry, because we give them a very low risk, low impact way to try THC, prove to themselves that they can handle it. It's not going to embarrass them in front of their friends or send them doing some sort of crazy thing that like the media sometimes makes it sound. And those folks are now finding their way to dispensaries in many states, right? And they're saying, you know what, maybe I'm ready to graduate to a gummy. Okay, let's go buy that product in a dispensary. So
speaking of graduation, one of the things that caught on very early on in the retail environment in Minnesota was a lot of people that gravitate towards this low dose option, but I still think there was this archaic dispensary behavior. People are looking at dollar per dosage and trying to find value there. So Jake, I love I don't know if snarky is the right word, the edgy social media about your latest 10 milligram beverage product coming out now. And so my question for you is knowing that the brand started off in this, I think you used the word spectrum, or 2 milligram to start, 5. Now you're finally convinced to take the plunge and get into this 10 milligram lane here. So has that shifted the brand ethos at all? Has that changed any of the messaging and positioning? But I guess more importantly, what finally made you guys say, okay, we're going to go for it and launch a 10 milligram option? Because I know for a long time it was, to your point, we have an audience that is resonating with these low dose, sessionable, stackable products that are pretty analogous to having something like a glass of wine, having light beer. 10 milligrams a little bit more potent. So what ultimately was the decision-making process internally for you guys to say, all right, we're going to do it. We're going to launch a 10 milligram option. And lastly, congrats on that.
It's an amazing product. You have to try it. The biggest reason was, over time, we established Cann as a microdose brand. So we were very hesitant, right, to be like the high boys, which is our 5 milligram product. Makes perfect sense. We have folks that bounce between the two. Some of them are separate, but there's a lot more sort of fluidity among those two. Where now we're talking about something which is 5 times more potent than our core product, right? That should be a different customer. It's definitely a different customer than anyone drinking the twos. And that scares me because it's sort of like I don't want somebody to mistake one for the other, right? We've spent so much time building this brand and really associating it with Microdose. Do you sort of risk eroding that brand equity? I think what we found being on the market and being in a lot of these state liquor stores, right, across a number of states, the amazing environments there this is happening in places you would have never thought, right? It's happening in the Southeast, the Midwest, places that do not have dispensaries. No one has the ability to go down the street into, a California dispensary and buy a tin of gummies, which is 100 milligrams. That doesn't exist in a lot of these markets. And so safe access to the cannabis plant in a lot of places right now is happening through hemp. And it's happening on the lower potency spectrum, which is good. I think that's a really good thing. I think it's not a bad model for how to introduce these products. But it means that you've got folks that have cannabis tolerances, right? Like they smoke weed and they want to have a THC drink. Like, well, from everything we've been talking about, Cann is not the product for people that smoke weed, really. I mean, some people tell us they like drinking it to avoid, having cotton mouth or whatever, but I don't think that's a large segment in our customer base, right?
Sure.
How do we address those people, right? And one of the things that finally convinced us that we should be in this space was, I don't know if you tried a lot of these 10 milligram drinks, but many of them are undrinkable, like undrinkably bad.
Yep.
And this is speaks to my soul, right? Because when we launched Cann, in large part, the drinks that were on the market were also undrinkably bad. And we had this idea that flavor matters and that consumers, when asked about this, care the most about taste. And they will come back and drink Cann again and again because of its taste. And so it didn't really seem right that we would deprive folks that have a tolerance, that want to drink a 10 milligram drink. Maybe they're not drinking a couple, but they want to have 10, that they shouldn't have an amazing flavor experience, that they shouldn't be able to have a blood orange cardamom, right? And have that come to life. And we care so much about the flavor experience of our customers that it really felt like that was off. And it took me a while to wrap my head around that because, people would say, if you just do it in the Cann flavors, that's what people want. And I kept thinking people wanted the Cann brand, right? Because everyone said Cann has to be on it. You have to keep the Cann brand on it. It won't work if you launch it under a different brand. And what they really were saying was what the Cann brand confers on a product is that it's going to taste great, right? That it's going to have that edge to it. That it says something about you bought Cann. And so I think it's a great thing that we're going to be able to introduce those products to folks that have higher tolerances. They deserve it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I like that you guys have such a lineup across the spectrum. I love the low boys myself personally. I obviously like the original. So it's nice having that 1, 2, 5, and 10, those options. Yeah. So you guys have taken a pretty unique approach marketing with your celebrity investors like Gwyneth Paltrow and Kate Hudson. How did you guys develop that strategy?
Yeah, this was really my co-founder, Luke, who, in the early days, we were lucky that we started in LA. So there's sort of proximity to a lot of these folks. We're also lucky in that there was an openness there, right? I mean, some of it is being in California. Some of it is having a livelihood, which sort of depends on what you put in your body and being really conscious of that, right? If you're waking up at 4 a.m. because you have a shoot, you can't be hungover with bloodshot red eyes, there's a level of attention that folks in entertainment broadly have about their bodies because it's connected to their livelihood. And many of them, for better or for worse, have had, really challenging dynamics with alcohol, right? And so there's also an openness coming from, yep, I went through that crazy 20s party thing. I drank way too much. I don't drink at all. Or I'm really, really mindful about how much I drink. And it's a drink a day and no more or whatever, right? We've heard sort of the gamut from folks. And that really, I think, created an openness to the product, which was great. And then we were just very, very generous in getting it to people. If you messaged us in the early days with a blue check, and this was back when a blue check on Instagram mattered, you couldn't just buy it. We would give you product. This is LA, so people are always trading on their proximity to fame. It's like, I'm so-and-so's hairdresser, or I'm their bodyguard, or I'm this. And we're like, great, we'll send you product. And then we will just, incessantly follow up with them asking, did they like it? Did they like it? How did it go? Do you have any feedback for us? I think, asking for feedback was a real tool in the early days because we were brand new. We were a new brand. Tell us what you think. And most people ignored us, right? They were just using it, us for the product. But every now and then someone would come through and they would say, she loves it. He loves it. Can we have more? Can you send it to this address? And usually Luke would drive at the end of the day up to some, random house in the canyons, and he would just sort of walk in with it. And where can I put this? Kind of like just trying to get in a little bit deeper. Let me tell you the story. Like, we just started the company, and like, it was amazing to see how people responded because they love the product. So it starts with the product, right? When people ask me, how can we replicate what Cann's done with celebrities? This is like so amazing. You got them all to invest. Like, they sent you money. Like, usually celebrities expect, brands to send them cash. And I tell them there's good news and bad news. The good news is I can tell you exactly how we did it. The bad news is it entirely depends on your product, right? And so I can't help you with that. But it really did. And they love the product so much they want to be a part of the story. And we treat them like investors, right? Like, we're not sending you like a 20-page, marketing agreement that your agent and manager are going to review. And like, that's not how it works for us. Like, you want to be a part of the story, you see the mountain, you want to come up it with us, great. Send us money, invest in our round. We'll hold the space open for folks. And we have actually allowed celebrities to invest, at all sorts of weird times. And they're the ones that can really sneak into these rounds. Then, every now and then we'll be like, hey, can you help us with this or can you help us with that, right? Would you go on CNBC? They want to interview you and things like that. And we've been really lucky that our celebrity investors have helped us out with that.
Yeah, that's a really unique approach. And obviously, it's probably very helpful to have those connections and be able to go on talk shows where you can actually use the word like cannabis and THC and things like that, which kind of leads into the next question of, obviously, marketing in this category is very difficult with all the different restrictions on the various platforms. So how does Cann go about navigating all those restrictions?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. We've gotten good at it, right? Because we've been in this world for 6 years. So we sort of know where some of those tripwires are. And in some cases, like, it's forced us to do really good, smart things in the business, right? Like fundamental word of mouth, community driven, event based, like local marketing, those strategies that really work. I mean, most people interact with Cann today on a retail store shelf. Like, it's amazing, right? We sold 3 times the number of cans last year through retail than we did online. Now, online feels like easier, right? Because we know that customer, we get all their personal information, right? We can keep marketing to them. So there's sometimes a temptation to keep kind of pushing there. And we do, but it sort of is becoming smaller and smaller as a portion of where you interact with Cann and the amount of Cann that's being sold. Folks that are drinking it are getting it more and more in stores. And we think that trend's only going to continue. So it starts to really look like more like the traditional beverage playbook, right? We're trying to increase visibility in the store. What's happening on shelf really matters. How many shelf facings we have, the product assortment there, making sure that that's in stock and that it's clearly labeled and packaged in ways that consumers sort of can interact with and get their questions answered. But at the same time, like, you're selling the brand. So how do you bring those sort of like core, salient, emotional, human needs to the forefront? And you're all doing this in like a tiny little space, right? So that's really been the focus. And sampling, we do a lot of sampling now. That can be a really helpful tool, right? Like I said, people drink this product and they have a like wave of surprise go over their face, and that's what really gets them hooked.
So is retail the most effective way in reaching new consumers for you guys, or has D2C been
I think they're both good,
the most
right?
effective?
We have better data on D2C, so we can I can tell you like down to like the second decimal point how effective it is, where with retail you don't really know, right? Like I sample 50 people, 25 of them bought product, right? Like a 6-pack. That feels pretty good. Seems like a good 2 hours spent, but we don't really know then how frequently those folks come back and what they buy, or if they buy something else. And so our intuition is that it's pretty darn good.
Yeah, I love that. We're bringing D2C to the conversation. Jake, to your point, I think the big value prop today or historically has been it enables access. And so for you, as somebody who came from this legacy market where there is no interstate commerce, you have to be in these, legal states. Now it's kind of opened up this massive new market. And it's really one of the big appeals of e-commerce. But the other one, which is exactly what you mentioned, is your feedback loops and what you can learn from D2C as opposed to retail is obviously apples to oranges. But my question for you is, how does an entity like Cann balance blending that data and focusing on resource allocation? So you're obviously getting sales data from online purchases. You're probably getting a plethora of spreadsheets and things like that from distributors all across the country. How do you guys make these strategic choices and say, okay, based off these different channels, here's how we're going to allocate resources? Is it maybe we ramp up ad spend for a dry January campaign, or okay, now we're going to focus on the the Southeast, there's a lot of markets opening up there. Maybe we should be hiring people, sales team to help with getting sips to lips. So how do you guys ingest all that data and then use it to ultimately make decisions on where to make your bets?
It's interesting, right? Because, in some cases you have all the data you need to make a decision, right? Like how effective is this dollar spent on an ad or this specific creative content or video? If we run this promotion, right, we get immediate feedback on how well it's doing. Similarly, we can test content through our own channels, right? Like we'll post something on our Instagram grid and it may be weird and funny, but like we learn whether it resonated or not. And we're like, okay, great, that worked. Or, oh no, it did not work. Maybe we run it as an ad, right? So there's sort of those worlds, those testing grounds where we can get data pretty quickly, where we can do fun things digitally, right? Where we sort of send traffic in a couple different directions, maybe test, the impact of making a change, which could be as small as like the color of a button or as big as like, the percent off that we're offering at a discount. And so, we do all that stuff and it can be helpful. I think what's it makes this such an interesting time to answer the question is there is so much opportunity. I mean, you mentioned like, oh, we're seeing a lot of sales in the Southeast. Like, should I be hiring a ton of people in Alabama and Louisiana? Like the answer is like, probably yes. And you could tell that story for 30 states and you could pick 30 on-premise locations, in each of those states that we should be trying to get, behind the bar at, or, some event or local thing that's happening in those markets that we should try to be a part of, or, even just like the Red Bull playbook of having these field teams. Like we have our field marketing is really focused on samplings because we see a huge benefit there. It's not even to begin at thinking about what, sort of folks just sort of in the community could do in terms of education and brand awareness, right? There's just so much opportunity. And so I think like part of what's challenging is you have a lot of experiments and tests to go run and you could almost devise a million of them. We could probably just do it right here on this call. And then the question is really about resource and time. Interestingly enough, like the data has been more on the easy side. Like we have, like to your point, we have a lot of this data. The hard part is having the time and resources to run these tests. I think that's the thing that, when you're just trying to get product on shelves and increase the number of accounts that sell your product, like that consumes the whole business on the retail side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that comes to mind for me as well, I haven't seen this playbook as prevalent in the THC beverage market space yet, but in other marketplaces, other categories, one of the things that is very prevalent is brands that if you can't convert that customer online, you then use that D2C engine to push them in store and ultimately get that purchase. This can have mechanisms in place to say, okay, maybe we can use our e-commerce engine to actually help with these in-store sales. And, granted, it's not us doing the fulfillment, owning the customer per se, but at least it might be helping with sell-through in some of these locations. Is that something that you guys talk about?
Yeah, we do this a lot, particularly as we launch new markets, right?
Okay.
Open for business. Yeah. We know all the people that are in those zip codes that have bought from us online. We now tell them where they can buy it in store. Mm-hmm. And we like that, right? Like our view of the world is that long term, these drinks are sold predominantly in retail. And the only reason, to your point, that people buy them online right now is because there's a lack of availability. And so, over time, those things will kind of come together. The online part will never go away, right? In the sense that we will still be able to acquire and market to customers digitally, whether they're buying that in store, whether they're buying it, through a GoPuff DoorDash kind of thing, or they're buying it, from us. I think the through the mail online will get, pressured over time just because of sort of like the economics of it. Right? There's like a reason. Think about how many drinks you buy in the mail, not that many. But that's just because we don't have the distribution networks built out yet in all of these territories.
Absolutely.
So you guys are still operating in both the regulated states as well as the hemp-derived
We are
market,
in
correct?
Dispensaries in California, but only in California.
In California, gotcha. So obviously the regulations are changing almost daily across the nation. How are you guys analyzing all the different changes seemingly day to day, staying nimble, compliant, while also building for scale?
It's fun, let me tell you, especially this time of year where every state seems to have a legislator in session and they're all intent on screaming and yelling about this. And local news likes to have all these headlines saying X state bans THC drinks or whatever. We want regulation, right? As a general position, our view is that like the things that are holding this industry back are actually all the bad actors, with 100,000 milligram Delta 8 chemically converted gummies that are branded like Skittles with a Z, right? Like we don't think those products should be anywhere. And so, I think it's a good thing to see the states debating this. It'd even be better if we got the FDA or the Tax and Trade Bureau to put consumer regulations at a federal level. I mean, we're starting to get a little bit crazy with the warning logos that's different by every state and all that stuff. But the net effect is positive, right? These are being debated out in the open. All the interests come to bear. States are really asking the question of, well, where do we draw the line? And they often draw that line in a place that we're okay with, right? Like I said, we're a microdose beverage. A 5 milligram cap on THC is not a bad thing for Cann. And that happens in some markets. In some of the markets where they've capped THC, the lowest, actually, we do pretty well. So, one of the ways you can manage it is by just reacting to what the rules say, right? Like we did this in Connecticut. They restricted it to 3 milligrams. We made a 3 milligram version of our product. It sells amazingly well. Like I think per capita sales are best in Connecticut than anywhere else in the country. It's pretty incredible. And so that's worked out really well. And I think being able to be nimble and making those adjustments, complying with the regulations, is step one. You can kind of go to step two a little bit, which is, can we influence those at all and engage in those conversations with policymakers and try to make sure that they're aware that, hey, if you put another warning logo in the regulations here, it's going to crush all these businesses that are trying to sell products in the state and generate tax revenue, because we'll have to make new packaging special for Georgia or whatever, and things like that are happening. So those are the more frustrating pieces, is like homogenizing the rules would be much welcome, but you sort of just figure it out, right? You navigate it. We'll know more in June than we know now, and we'll know even more in August as all these states wrap up their legislative sessions.
Jake, I wanted to kind of revisit part of the conversation around brand equity, and we can tie it into regulations as well. One of the trends that's obviously very common is, because you guys have subsidized this marketplace, the barrier to entry now is so low. And so you see all these local types of brands. It's a random brewery just decides we're going to be a THC seltzer brand today. And that pops up and it keeps compounding over and over across the country now. And so my question for you is, it's leading to shoppers becoming more promiscuous. They want to try out a new brand. They want to try a new flavor, new dosage. As you're seeing this new category that you guys have helped pioneer become more commoditized, where is Cann's moat today and kind of long term? And how do you fend off all these new brands that enter when the barrier to entry has become so low?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? This is sort of a problem that's plagued craft beer for a long period of time, right? This sort of like fickle nature of the customer, right? What draws them to craft is also what, it draws them away from any given brand on any given day. I don't know. We haven't seen this yet. I mean, this is definitely in the early stage, right? We're really low awareness. I do think we have a shopper which is trying a few, like survey our customers. So we know, at least for our customers, about 55% of them only drinking, like not trying anything else, tried it and didn't like it. We're like ride or die. The other 45% play with different brands, different form factors, right? A lot of them like gummies. We learned that recently, which was interesting. Mm-hmm. And some of our competitors, right? And we want to understand like why they pick us versus others. A lot of times they just want to try a different flavor, right? So they're like, oh, I love Cann's blood orange. Let me try, so-and-so's tangerine or whatever. And maybe they like it and maybe they don't, right? One of the things we do observe is folks come back to Cann and they'll tell us things like, I tried them all and yours are the best. Or, it's the taste that is what gets me. So we like to see that. But, people are adventurous. Sometimes people want like more of a seltzer water. We're not really a seltzer water, right? Like we have more of like a vibrant taste. It's still light and refreshing, but it's not just flavor and sparkling water. So some folks, sort of prefer that product. Other folks want something more intense from a flavor standpoint, right? They're maybe buying one of these bottles and they're making a cocktail. We're not as concentrated from a flavor standpoint as a cocktail, right? Because we're much lower calorie. And so, you get that mix. It's just like if you think about the alcohol overlay, like what that might look like in this category, people will all find their favorite drinks and different versions of this or that. And so I think we're in the early days, but at least we're sort of guided by our consumer and believing that flavor experience really matters.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So looking ahead and kind of, taking a 30,000 foot overview of the category as a whole, where do you see the cannabis beverage category in 5 years?
Yeah, it will be big. 5 years, maybe it's half the size of beer. I don't know, maybe that's aggressive, but we think it can be half the size of beer pretty darn soon. It depends a little bit on multi-outlet chains and some of those folks and how quickly they can feel comfortable stocking these products. If you just sort of look at the velocities of this category in a place like Total Wine, and you make some assumptions about where ultimately it can be sold or will be sold, it's not hard to get to half the size of beer pretty easily.
And same time frame here, what keeps you up at night from a pessimistic or a negative overview?
The thing I
standpoint
worry
over
about
the
the
next
most, we
5
talked
years?
about it a little bit, right, with bad actors, right? What I worry about is, this is an adult
Mhm.
product. These are adult beverages. We believe they should be sold where other adult beverages are sold, which is alongside alcohol. These are not products for minors. These are not products that, should be loosely sort of like sold at, out of gas stations and smoke shops and things like that to whoever walks in. And I think that's really clear. Now, obviously, our products, especially our 2 milligram product, they're so far on the end of the sort of spectrum of risk that they probably are fine if, even like your young child got into them, right? Like we'll learn more with science, but like this, you are not going to die from consuming Cann. Whereas you very easily could from, drinking liquor or something like that, right? For a small child. So I have like, I'm not sort of bothered by the risk profile of our products, but I am bothered by the risk profile of some of the stuff I see in the marketplace. That's like 1,000 milligrams of chemically converted CBD into some sort of intoxicating blend of stuff I've never heard of. Like we got to get rid of that stuff. It's hurting us, and there's safer ways to sell the medical versions of these products, right? We have the dispensary channel. Like a lot of those products should be in dispensary channel. Products that are infringing on existing brands IP, like Skittles with the Z, belong nowhere. And I think that the big risk is that goes on for too long, and it starts to reflect back on the beverages that adults love and should have access to. I mean, no one wants to ban hemp, not these products, not Cann. But I think the risk is that you could end up in a situation where, something horrible happens. Somebody jumps off of a ledge because they were, too intoxicated on a product that they shouldn't have bought because they're a minor, right? Like that is me.
Yeah, I remember last year before the Hemp Beverage Festival, Cann was in town, and one of the people was giving a quote basically about an English second language bus driver who thought they were getting just regular gummies, ended up being like Delta 8 gummies. And this person's driving a bus full of people. And like, luckily they realized something was wrong and pulled over. But you have stories like that in the back of your mind,
Right.
being like, oh my God, that's
how amazing
what
that
gets
the
us all.
intoxicant that we're talking about here is one that when you feel it, you actually pull over. Right? You like stop the car, pull over, something's wrong. I think that's an important point. No one should drink Cann and drive, but we're talking about something different here than some of these other intoxicants, which is
Yeah, it gives you that positive feedback loop. It's setting in quicker. It's more of a mild effect, and it also wears off sooner as well. And that's a very important distinction, because the edible story, it's an hour later, and you're like, oh, that's not what I thought it was. But I also wanted to talk a bit, not about the risk from maybe a long-term 5-year view, but some of the risks today. Obviously, we've talked about regulations, things like that, but we're also seeing this turbulent headwinds in the macro economy. We have tariffs that go on and off. We have inflation, things like aluminum or cardboard costs could go up. But long story short, you basically have shoppers that have less purchasing power and discretionary funds. And so how does an entity like Cann balance being capital efficient while still growing?
The good news is we've been down this road before a few times. I mean, when we launched the business, we were in the global Cann shortage. This was before the pandemic, and then you had it was even made worse by all of the supply chain interruptions that happened through that period of time. And when we had tariffs, 1.0. So, we've gotten pretty good at handling some of these situations in the supply chain and how they flow through. Some of it you can't predict, right? Some of it, if you're paying too close attention, you actually make the wrong call, right? Because it's changing so quickly. So I think taking like a more medium-term view is a smart approach, and being prepared, right? Like we know that, okay, great, there's tariffs are coming on Mexico. We have, we source our agave from Mexico. It's amazing. It's organic. Well, let's buy some more in advance of that, right? And some of that works, and sometimes it doesn't work, right? But there is a level of awareness that can help you navigate some of what's going on. But a lot of it is really hard, and it's like a nature of a scaling business, nature of a startup, and you have to have a little bit of a bias to action and a growth mentality. But we're getting to that point in the curve where incremental sort of improvements in the operations, the costs have huge impact on the business, and so we got to kind of do that too. It's a multi-objective function that we're maximizing.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to end the conversation here. What does a successful exit look like for Jake and Cann? Is it an IPO, a strategic acquisition, or something else?
We'll see. It's a great question, right? It's obviously one that we think about in the business a lot, just strategically, right? Because if your end game is to sell this business to a big alcohol company, you may make a different strategic decision on route to market in a number of states versus not. There's a lot of really interesting things going on in the public markets that may or may not be interesting for this business, right? A lot of folks in the broader cannabis industry had played this experiment out in Canada and it didn't go amazingly well. So there's like some trepidation there, right? How do you do it right this time? But it looks like, there's potentially opportunities in the NASDAQ, which would be really cool for this business. And look, I mean, what's fun about Beverage is when it starts working, it really starts working and it keeps working. And you start seeing the benefits of that fixed cost leverage in the financial profile of the business. And beverage companies can generate a lot of cash, which can, run the business independently. We're not there yet, pretty darn close, and scale continues to help. So there's also just a world where we think a lot about Cann, the brand, what that means. And we've always wanted to build a mainstream global brand. And that hasn't really changed since we started. So there's that sort of like, well, let's just keep doing this thing. It's fun and why not, which is a calculation as well.
So Jake, thank you so much for sharing your time and your journey with us today. If our listeners don't know where to find Cann right now, where can they find Cann and follow what
we're
you're
available
doing?
on drinkcann.com and I think something like 35 states and, local liquor stores, independent liquor stores, Total Wine, and others in a bunch of other states in retail.
Thank you again. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel for more content as well. And until next time, guys,
Thanks,
cheers.
Thank you.